The Monday, January 25th, 2021, Leavenworth Board of Zoning Appeals. We do have a quorum. In fact, all members are present. Second item on the agenda is approval of the minutes for the 21 December 2020 meeting. I was not present at that, so I will abstain, but are there any additions, changes, corrections to the meeting minutes? Or do I have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Second.
Motion and second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
And I was in that.
Aye.
Okay. No old business, new business. Number one, the election of the officers. We're going to postpone until the next meeting so that we can get a list of our term dates, which may influence the nominations for the elections. The next item, 2020-38, 2500 South 4th Street. Hold a public hearing for that. Wherein the applicant is requesting a variance to allow more than one sign on the storefront for a property zoned GBD, General Business District. Staff report, please.
Okay, Jackie Porter, our city planner, will handle this one.
This item was tabled from last month. The development regulations for this limit the number of wall signs allowed for each side of the structure or part of the structure clearly identified as a storefront to one sign. Care Pharmacy has one existing wall sign on the east wall of Care Pharmacy. The variance request is for an additional sign on the east side of the building. The proposed sign is located on the northeast portion of the building, reading Kung Fu Tea and a logo, and it is roughly 9.5 square feet. The proposed sign meets the size requirements of a GBD zoning district. As requested from the previous meeting, the conceptual image and material makeup descriptions was provided. As up in the attachments and on the screen.
Yes, okay.
And the applicant is here and up on there, so yes. We have two representations for this item, if you have any questions.
Okay. Any questions regarding the staff report?
I have none.
Okay. I think probably since this came up before, it was just a matter of providing that input. That was the question. Okay. Any discussion amongst the commissioners before I open the public hearing? Hearing none?
I just have a question for staff.
Yep, go ahead, Kathy.
Hey, Julie, I just had a question, and it could apply to any building, but when the decal advertisements, if you will, that are put in windows, if those can be seen from the street, are they considered signs?
So the way our regulations are written, they are considered signs, but they do not require a permit, and so they do not count against exterior signage requirements. And they're limited in how much of the window area they can cover. So yes, those are specifically defined as signs, but they have a little bit different requirements and do not require a permit.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Any other questions? If not, I'll go ahead and open the public hearing. If there's anyone who would like to speak either in favor of or against, please come up to the podium and state your case, or through the Zoom. If the requester wants to make any kind of statement. And seeing none, I'll go ahead and close the public hearing then. And go through the 5 items. A request for a variance may be granted upon the finding of the board that all the following conditions have been met. The board shall make a determination on each condition, and the finding shall be entered in the record. Number 1, or A. that the variance request that arises from such condition which is unique to the property in question and is not ordinarily found in the same zone or district and is not created by an action or actions of the property owner or the applicant. Commissioner Gervasini?
I agree.
Agree.
Agreed.
Agree. Commissioner Kemp? And
Oh, you're muted, Kathy.
Sorry, agree.
And Commissioner Bates?
I agree.
Okay. Second, that the granting of the permit for the variance will not adversely affect the rights of adjacent property owners or residents. Why don't we go in the exact same order we just did?
Agree.
Agree?
Agree.
Commissioner Kemp?
Agree.
Commissioner Bates?
Agree.
Number three, that the strict application of the provisions of the development regulations from which variance is requested will constitute unnecessary hardship upon the property owner represented in the application.
Agree.
Agree?
Agree.
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 That the variance desired will not adversely affect the public health, safety, morals, order, convenience, prosperity, or general welfare.
Agree.
Agree?
Agree.
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 And lastly, the granting of the variance desired will not be opposed to the general spirit and intent of the development regulations.
Agree.
Agree?
Agree.
Commissioner Kemp?
Agree.
And Commissioner Bates?
Agree.
In agreement on all of the conditions. In granting a variance, the board may impose such conditions, safeguards, and restrictions upon the premises benefited by the variance as may be necessary to reduce or minimize any potentially injurious effects of such a variance upon other property in the neighborhood and to carry out the general purpose and intent of these development regulations. Are there any such conditions, safeguards, or restrictions that any commissioner wishes to add?
No.
No?
No.
Okay. I would say the action is approved without any conditions.
Okay.
Next item.
Thanks.
2021-03, 1922 Fifth Avenue. Hold a public hearing wherein the applicant is requesting an exception from section 105C4 of the adopted development regulations to allow the restoration of a building that is not in conformance with the regulations for the zoning district. Staff report, please.
Okay, as you stated, this is a request for an exception for the property located at 1922 Fifth Avenue. And just before we get into this too much, I wanted to talk about the difference between exceptions and variances a little bit, since this came up at the last meeting and was a kind of a point of confusion. I apologize for not being here at that one. So we honestly just haven't had any requests for exceptions come up in my 7 years of being here until the last few months. So it just kind of in the course of things, that's not one of the sections of the regulations that we had looked at since we hadn't had to use it. So basically, the BZA is tasked with looking at two types of applications, either a variance or an exception. A variance, a property owner can request a variance for pretty much any requirement that's in the development regulations except for use. A property owner cannot request a variance to allow a use that is specifically prohibited in a zoning district. So someone could not request a variance to allow a warehouse in a residential district. But anything else, any sort of requirement, height, you're all familiar with the types of cases that you see. A property owner could request a variance for basically anything else that's in the development regulations. Exceptions are a little bit different, and there's only a few instances in the regulations that are called out for being appropriate for a property to request an exception. And those are typically going to deal with existing situations. So there may be an existing situation that in order to continue or to modify that existing situation would need an exception to the regulations. Variances are typically more for new situations. You would need to request a variance before being allowed to construct something new or start a new activity. So in taking a look at our regulations, state statute, and the way other cities have their regulations worded, we're pretty much in line with other cities in regards to the instances in which an exception would be an appropriate action. What we're a little bit out of sync with is those requirements, the A through G, in regards to an exception. So when you have a variance, you go through each of those criteria and make a vote on each of them. Those criteria are specified in state statute, and so we have to have those in there to review and approve a variance. State statute defines an exception, but it does not list those criteria that you would need to go through like it does for a variance. So in looking at other cities, like I said, they have real similar types of situations that would need an exception request, but they do not have those list of criteria to consider. It's basically just they're requesting an exception, and then you would consider the exception and then vote yay or nay on the exception as a whole, not that list of criteria. So what I suspect happened is when these development regulations were written back, I believe in 2011, before I came, whoever wrote those regulations was trying to address some specific instances with putting those criteria in there. However, in taking a look at, again, statute and what other cities have in place, that's not the correct way to address an exception. Since it's in the regulations, though, we can't just change that at a staff level. Every year, we go through the regulations as a whole, and we come up with any modifications that need to be made. Those go through the Planning Commission and then the City Commission to update the development regulations, and those are approved, and then we go for the next year and then kind of update as we go. So we're getting ready to undertake our annual review of the development regulations, so we will modify this at this point this year and get that to where it needs to be to address an exception. However, since it's in there, we're just going to have to kind of muddle through it as best we can and go through those criteria. So what I did, and I know you kind of did this on the fly last time, for each of these criteria, I added some commentary for each of them. The first 3 are applicable, the last 4 are not. So when we get to them, we'll kind of talk about how you should vote when we get to those. But that's just kind of an overview of exceptions. We'll kind of get into this. If you have any more questions as we go through it, we can kind of address them, or if you had any now.
I have one.
Sure.
If a structure is conforming and 55% of the structure is burned, let's say a residence, do I have to get an exemption?
If it is conforming,
It's conforming.
if it's conforming with our current regulations, no, you would not need an exception. So in this instance, this is an existing non-conforming structure.
I'm talking about generalities. I'm
Yes.
not talking about
No.
this particular.
Nope, if you
case.
have an existing structure that's conforming with everything in the regulations and it burned, you would need to do nothing else in order to rebuild it.
Okay. My problem with the way this is written is that if it's non-conforming because the side setbacks or the rear setbacks are in the city, and in the case last month, we had a PUD, and it was non-conforming. Somebody approved that building in the side setbacks, because I don't think the setbacks have changed from the side from 6 feet and the rear to 25 feet. So I'm wondering, or I'm recommending that when you start to look at restructuring and rewording this, it might be better to define a little bit more of what you call non-conforming, especially if the building permit was granted by the city, because the burden, I believe, is on the city to not tie somebody up to an exception and cause them to come to the BZA to get permission to start getting their house back in order.
Sure. So the case last month was a little bit extra complicated. It was a PUD. It did have established required side yard setbacks. That house was constructed not in conformance with the setbacks that were established at the time that it was constructed. So we didn't have a copy of the building permit from back then, so it was either A, approved at the staff level incorrectly whenever that came through, or B, was constructed incorrectly, maybe was approved as it should have been, and then just there was a surveying error out in the field and it was constructed incorrectly. So we don't know what happened. Those are two kind of complicating factors with that one. With a more typical situation, you might think of a home up here in the north part of Leavenworth. At the time that these houses were constructed, those side yard and front yard and rear yard setbacks were not what they are today. There probably weren't even any requirements in place. So those houses, we can assume, were constructed conforming at the time that they were built, although they no longer meet our current standards. So that would be a case like tonight.
Right.
So, like I said, the one last month was a little bit extra complicated. I think you guys did a good job getting through it as best you could, but yeah, that's absolutely something that we'll take a look at as we get into rewording this and making sure that we're very clear and explicit in what we're considering.
Okay.
I have a question.
Sure, Kathy.
So the application says, variance request to reduce side yard setback by 1 foot, which sounds like a variance request, because that's specifically what it said. Should it not more accurately reflect that we're giving, or he's asking for an exception to allow reconstruction of a structure that was destroyed more than 50%? I mean, isn't that really the item that we're voting on, as opposed to allowing a setback of less, 1 less foot?
Yeah, are you talking about what the applicant wrote in the application? Yeah, because the applicant wrote in the application that it was a variance request to reduce the side yard setback. It is actually an exception. And so again, I think there's some confusion with it, and this may be something where, just from an administrative standpoint, we probably need to take a look at having two separate applications so that we can make sure that we're, again, more clear with applicants what they're actually needing to request instead of having, multiple options on the same application, because that does create some confusion in these types of situations.
Well, no, more to my point is, it says to reduce the setback. Is that really the issue that we're voting on, or are we voting on to allow reconstruction of a structure that was, more than 50% destroyed?
I see what you're saying. What you're voting on is to allow reconstruction of a non-conforming structure that was more than 50% destroyed. And
Okay, so we're not really addressing the setback per se.
No, so I think probably the confusion was when we had talked to the applicant, we let them know that the issue was that side yard setback. That's what made the structure non-conforming. And so then that's what got carried through onto the application. So, again, they're kind of confusing situations. And so it probably would help if we had two separate applications to make that a little bit more clear and explicit for staff, for the applicants, and then for the board.
So
So would have a variance to reduce the, setback by 1 foot, is that even an option in this case? Is that something that he would have been, had the ability to apply for? Because then
So-
all this goes away, assuming they get approved.
Yeah, so he could have, so the reason a variance would not necessarily be the best option, when you have a variance, since you do have those criteria, they have to meet all 5 of those criteria. And in a lot of these situations,
Right,
they may
right.
not be able to meet all 5 of those criteria. So even though they have an existing situation that was there and it may be appropriate to rebuild, you may not be able to actually vote on in the affirmative on each 5 of those criteria, depending on what it is. So again, the exception is really meant to address these existing non-conforming situations so that they don't have to go through that burden of meeting all 5 of those criteria that they would need to meet on a variance.
Is there any thought to, I know that.
Okay, thank you.
When the regulations change, it becomes what should have been a legal conforming to now a legal non-conforming. What happened to the grandfather clause that used to be in there, that basically you were safe if when you constructed it, you were legal and conforming, but now legal non-conforming makes you go through this process?
Yep, so any legal non-conforming structure is allowed to stay and continue in operation. Until it's
something like this
destroyed
triggers
or
it.
they want to expand or something like that. So it's still grandfathered in the sense that it can continue. We're not gonna make them tear it down to come into conformance. It's when it's destroyed and they're wanting to rebuild it, that we need to consider whether or not it's appropriate to rebuild it as it was.
Who came up with the 50%?
I'm not sure who came up with it, but in looking at other cities, that's fairly standard. That
State statute.
that cities have is that's standard across what the cities have.
In the building codes and everything else as well, anything 50% over market value, it's the same.
Yeah, that's
verbiage.
fairly pretty industry standard.
I would think if the shell is good and stable, it wouldn't matter if it was 49% or 51%. If the shell is good, why not let them rebuild without having them to apply for a variance and have to pay a fee?
Yeah, and that's pretty standard.
So is there a variance on file allowing the side yard setback?
No, again, this would have been something that would have been in conformance with the regulations at the time when it was built.
Okay. So the building permit right now that is on file or that may be on file does allow that?
Yeah, so we don't have building permits records back this far, but we can see that it's consistent with other homes that were constructed in the area, at the same time.
Okay, thank you.
Do we know when this house was built?
I'm not sure exactly when it was built. Once we get into it, the applicant may be able to answer that once we get to that portion.
Okay. I would, for a footnote, a lot of the fences weren't really built on the property lines, and so if somebody in reviewing that is looking at an existing fence and making a determination, I would ask that it be cross-checked with GIS and maybe a surveyor or something, just to validate that those fences are actually on the property lines and not off.
So we check them as much as we can. That's been sort of a policy decision at the city commission level that they do not want to require a survey for fence permits.
Yeah.
So that's really up to the applicant and their contractor to put it in the correct location. And, we can give them a GIS map of their property, but that's, that can be inaccurate up to 10 plus feet in
That's
any
true,
direction.
but at least it.
Yeah, so we do
It's the best that
that.
anybody has without having to pay somebody.
And so we
to
do
go out.
give that to applicants, but it's their burden to make sure that it's actually placed correctly. And then if at some point down the line, there's a dispute with a neighbor about where the fence is placed, that's a civil matter between the two neighbors.
in an older neighborhood like this, that the original owner, this might be the 5th or 6th
Yeah.
iteration, nobody knows, they just assume and then it end up costing somebody money.
Right.
Okay, anyway, that's all I had.
Okay, is everybody ready to get into the application? Okay. Okay. So again, this is a request for an exception for the property located at 1922 Fifth Avenue. And I will get it up here on the map, get this shared with everybody. Okay, so again, it's a request for an exception as allowed by section 1.05C to allow the restoration of a non-conforming structure. So the property is occupied by an existing single-family home, which did suffer a fire in 2020 that resulted in repairs totaling more than 50% of the market value of the home. So the property is zoned R16, and that does require a 6-foot side yard setback. As best we can tell, based on GIS, which again is going to be inaccurate a little bit, the side yard setbacks are approximately 4 feet on both sides, again making this a legal non-conforming structure. So I did put in the language here for section 1.05C in regards to the destruction of a non-conforming structure that just states if a non-conforming structure is damaged by more than 50% of its fair market value, such building shall not be restored if such building is not in conformance with the regulations for the zoning district in which it is located, or an exception is granted by the Board of Zoning Appeals. The applicant does intend to restore the building on its original foundation, so it will be going back as it had been built to its prior legal non-conforming status. So I believe we've got the applicant online here, so if you have any questions for him, otherwise we can get into the criteria for the exception.
Just a comment question. So everything that we are going to do here is based on that being a residential property,
Yes.
not as it looks now, it was a daycare center operated by the owner who lived in the residence.
Yep, so the owner did have a valid special use permit for a home daycare operation at this location. One of the requirements for home daycares is that it is the primary residence of the operator, which had been the case at the time prior to there being a fire at this location. After the fire, the owner, in order to keep operating her daycare, did have to move out into another home here in the Leavenworth area. She did obtain a new special use permit to operate a home daycare at her new location. So she's currently operating there. But you are correct, if the property owner wants to move back into this location and continue operating as a daycare center, that will go ahead and require a new special use permit, since the previous one for this location had been invalidated after she moved out. And again, one of the requirements for home daycare is that it's the primary residence of the operator, so it cannot just be a commercial daycare center with nobody living there.
Okay, all right, thank you. Do we open the public hearing at this point, or did you say you wanted to go through the?
No, you
criteria?
can open it. Like I said, I believe we've got the applicant online here, if you wanted to hear from him.
Okay, does anyone want to speak either for or against this request? And
I'd like to speak for it.
oh,
So we'll lose again.
Okay, if you could just state your
Can
name
you
and
hear me?
address.
We can hear you.
Okay, you can go ahead if you would just want to state your name.
Okay, I'm just, the press service here. My name is Dan Thorman.
Yeah.
Why is there two of them?
Somehow.
You hear me now?
Yep, now we can.
Now?
Yes.
Okay. My name is Dan Thorman. Cell phone.
He has it on his phone and his laptop, so it's echoing.
Sorry, I had two going in case I lost service.
Yeah, I think you're gonna need to close down one of your,
My name is Dan Thorman. Two going in case I lost service. I'm Norman Serco in Leavenworth. We applied for the permit. I can't hear anything. My mic's off.
oh, we're
We're
letting you
listening.
speak.
We're listening. Go ahead.
Okay. I work in Leavenworth and many communities. I own the north half of the state of Kansas for Serpro and deal in many, many different cities. But the normal procedure is that if you're within the setback, you have to provide a fireproof assembly or within that 5-foot area, which in the engineering plans we submitted allowed for that. So we've met the, not necessarily the criteria of zoning, but we've met the criteria for the International Building Code. So we've done all the things appropriately to ensure we're meeting all the proper and safe requirements. So we're going back, it's on the exact existing footprint, and it's the code is under the International Residential Code that it was where the 50% comes from, and it's a national standard, but it's based upon value, not upon actual physical structure damage. The actual physical structure damage was probably 10% of the building, but because of the value, it raises beyond the 50%, but the house is still very much intact, other than the little one-car garage section. So, if you have any questions, it's hopefully pretty clear cut.
Sir, are you the owner?
I'm not the owner of the property, I'm the owner of Serpro.
He's the contractor.
Okay.
Yeah.
We're the contractor doing the restoration.
Okay. So there is no owner or
No, the owner is not online tonight.
applicant?
No, she's not online tonight.
Okay, all right. Any questions of the Serpro?
No.
Okay. All right, thank you. And, well, I assume that's it because the other two are commissioners. Okay, I will go ahead and close the public hearing and open it up for discussion. And I guess now, Julie, the floor is yours.
Yep, so, we'll have you go through the criteria again, since they're in the regulations, we do have to kind of go through them just to record those, votes on each of those for the record. So we'll do the same thing like we do for a variance. You can read each of the criteria, then take a vote on each of them. For the last four, again, they are not applicable to this particular situation. And so I wrote in there, so your vote will be either to affirm or disaffirm, deny that those four criteria are applicable. So when we get to those last four, I've said the item is not applicable. So if your vote is agree, you would be agreeing that it is not applicable.
Okay. And I, when we get to those, I can combine and just say
You can, yep,
D,
items.
D, E, F, and G
Or not applicable.
are not applicable,
You
does
can,
everyone
yes, you
concur?
absolutely can.
Okay. All right, if everyone's ready, we'll start with A. The proposed exception complies with all applicable provisions of these development regulations, including intensity of use regulations, yard regulations, and use limitations. The requested exception relates to a reduced side yard setback as specifically allowed in section 105 of the development regulations and complies with all other applicable provisions. Commissioner Gervasini?
I agree.
Agree. Agree. Commissioner Kemp?
Agree.
And Commissioner Bates?
Agree.
B, the proposed exception at the specified location will contribute to and promote the welfare or convenience of the public. The proposed exception contributes to and promotes the welfare of the public by allowing the reconstruction of an existing non-conforming single-family residence after the property suffered damage by fire, displacing the former residence. Commissioner?
Agree.
Agree. Agree. Commissioner Kemp?
Agree.
Agree.
And C, the proposed exception will not cause substantial injury to the value of other property in the neighborhood in which it is to be located. The proposed exception will not cause substantial injury to the value of the property in the neighborhood as the home will be restored to its original state. No other modifications are proposed. And I assume that that's not just the original state, but and up to code
Yes.
and
Yep, in order to have those building permits approved, they have to meet current building code
right,
standards.
because just to restore it to its original state.
Yeah, correct, yeah, you're
I
correct.
might not like that, okay, all right, so
I
Commissioner.
agree.
Agree? Agree. Commissioner Kemp?
Agree.
Agree.
And D, E, F, and G are determined to not be applicable to the specific exception proposed. So the votes will be if we concur with each of those not being applicable. Commissioner
I
Jersey?
agree.
I agree.
I agree.
Commissioner Kemp?
Agree.
And Commissioner Bate? Okay. All right, based on concurrence for all of those,
The exception is
request the exception be allowed.
Okay,
Okay, and back to the beginning.
I'll move that we adjourn.
that is it. Again, we do not have any items for next month's meeting. We haven't hit the deadline for March, so we may see you then. But again, I will send out everybody's term expirations tomorrow, so that you can kind of think about what you'd like to do in terms of that.
Okay,
We will meet in March. I just received a full.
We have something,
Yeah.
okay. Okay, well then we'll see you in March.
okay. We have a motion to adjourn. Do I have a second?
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
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 Meeting is adjourned. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, everybody.